creature should not have been there. That was the first thing every guard agreed upon afterward, when the story was told and retold in hushed voices through the stone corridors of Valdris Palace, when the servants whispered about it over their morning bread, and the nobles tried to explain it away with logic that crumbled the moment anyone looked too closely. The northern snow leopard had been extinct for 300 years. Every scholar said so. Every text confirmed it. The last recorded. Sighting had been etched into the palace archives in ink so old it had faded to the color of dust. A single line in the annals of the ancestral kings that read, "The pale hunter walks no more among us, and with her passing, the age of miracles ends. 300 years of nothing. 300 years of silence from the northern mountains, from the glacial peaks that scraped the underside of clouds and held their secrets like a fist-hold stone. And then, on a Tuesday morning in the deep cold of the month of frost, it simply appeared at the palace gate, as if it had an appointment. The guards saw it first. 2 of them, both seasoned men who had served the crown for over a decade, both trained to face threats without flinching, both utterly undone by the sight of that white shape moving through the pre-dawn dark toward the iron gates of Valdris Palace. It was enormous. That was what they said first, before anything else, before the color or the eyes or the way it moved with a silence. So complete it seemed to absorb sound rather than simply avoid making it. It was enormous, and it was white, and it was looking at the gates as if it expected them to open. One of the guards had reached for the alarm bell. The creature had turned its gaze on him, yellow eyes burning like candle flames behind glass, and his hand had simply stopped moving. Not from a spell, he would swear to it later. Not from any force he could name. It was more like his body had received a message that his mind had not yet processed, and the message was very simple. This creature means no harm, and raising an alarm would be the wrong thing to do. He lowered his hand. The other guard did not move at all. They both stood there, while the great white leopard sat down in front of the iron gates, curled its tail around its massive paws, and waited with the patience of something that has been waiting for centuries, and has learned that patience is not a hardship, but simply a form of certainty. By the time the morning shift arrived, a small crowd had gathered on the inside of the gate, nobles and servants alike standing at a careful distance, no one speaking above a murmur. Word had reached the palace steward, then the head of palace security, then 3 different advisors, each of whom had come to look and gone away with the same expression, a combination of disbelief and something older and more unsettled beneath it, the look of a person who has encountered something that does not fit into any category they possess. The leopard ignored all of them. It sat. It waited. It did not growl or pace or show any sign of aggression, but neither did it respond to attempts at communication, not to the carefully trained handlers who were summoned from the royal stables, not to the court mage who arrived smelling of incense and tried 3 separate spoken invocations, not to the head of the royal guard who stood before it with his hand on his sword and his best authoritative voice and said, very clearly, "You cannot be here." The leopard had blinked at him with those yellow eyes, and somehow managed to communicate, with no movement whatsoever, that it found his statement entirely irrelevant. Lena Ashvale knew none of this when she came up from the archives that morning. She rarely knew anything that happened above ground before it was several hours old, and already common knowledge, which was precisely the way she preferred it. The underground archives of Valdris Palace were her domain in the way that forgotten places become the domain of people who need somewhere to disappear, not through any official designation, but through the simple fact that no one else wanted to be there. The archives smelled of old paper and cold stone, and the particular dusty sweetness of ink that had been drying for centuries. The torches along the walls burned low and orange, and the silence was so complete that Lena had learned to hear her own heartbeat in it, learned to find that sound comforting, rather than lonely, which perhaps said something about the life she had built for herself in the margins of the court. She was 24 years old. She had lived at Valdris Palace for 6 years, since her father's death had left her technically homeless, and the palace had accepted her into its staff with the indifference of a large institution absorbing one small, quiet person. She had been a records clerk first, then a junior archivist, and now she held the unofficial title of senior keeper of the ancient manuscripts, which was a grand name for the fact that she was the only person willing to spend hours each day in the cold underground rooms deciphering text that had not been read in living memory. She was carrying a stack of newly copied pages when she came through the door that connected the archive stairwell to the palace's east courtyard, and the first thing she noticed was the crowd. The second thing she noticed was the quality of the silence within that crowd, which was different from ordinary silence in the way that held breath is different from ordinary breathing. Everyone was looking at the main gate. Lena followed their gaze, and for a moment she did not understand what she was seeing, because what she was seeing was impossible. Then, the impossible thing turned its head, and its yellow eyes found her across the entire courtyard, across the distance, and the crowd, and the cold morning air. And something happened inside Lena's chest that she had no word for. A sensation like a key, turning in a lock she had not known existed. Her papers fell. She did not notice them fall. She was already walking toward the gate, moving through the crowd without thinking about it, people parting for her without understanding why. Everyone watching as the small, plainly dressed archivist with ink on her fingers and her brown hair coming loose from its pins walked straight up to the iron gate of Valdris Palace, while every trained professional in the kingdom stood back, and the great white leopard rose to its feet and pressed its enormous head against the iron bars, and made a sound that was not quite a purr, and not quite anything else. A sound of recognition so deep it seemed to come from somewhere older than language. "Hello," Lena said, because she could not think of anything else to say. And her voice came out small and wondering and entirely without the fear that should have been there. The leopard made that sound again. Lena reached out, very slowly, and touched the white fur between the bars, and the creature closed its eyes with the expression of something that has finally, after a very long time, come home. Behind her, she heard the crowd exhale. She heard someone say, in a voice stripped entirely of its usual courtly composure, "What in the name of every ancestor?" She did not turn around. She was looking at the leopard, at the impossible creature that should not exist, and feeling something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten the texture of it. She felt seen. The commotion that followed was significant. The gates were opened, which the head of the royal guard had refused to allow until this moment, and the leopard walked through them with a dignity that made the guards on either side stand up straighter without quite knowing why. It walked directly to Lena, circled her once with that same silence, and then lay down at her feet with a completeness of intention that left no room for misinterpretation. It chose her, in front of 30 witnesses, in the cold morning light of the east courtyard of Valdris Palace. The supposedly extinct northern snow leopard chose a junior archivist with ink on her fingers and no family name worth speaking, and lay down at her feet as if it had always intended to do exactly this. Lena stood very still, looking down at the white head resting near her shoes, and thought, with the slightly detached clarity that sometimes arrives in moments of profound shock, "My life has just changed in a way I cannot undo." She was not wrong. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The palace had a rhythm, and disruptions to that rhythm had consequences that rippled outward in ways both visible and invisible. By mid-morning, the leopard's arrival had reached the ears of Lady Vivian Ashford, before the frost had even melted from the courtyard stones. Vivian had been at Valdris for 2 years, long enough to establish herself so thoroughly in the social architecture of the court that removing her would have required demolishing several walls. She was the daughter of Lord Ashford of the Eastern Territories, beautiful in the way that sharp things are beautiful, all clean lines and deliberate grace. And she had spent the past 18 months cultivating a relationship with King Cassian that she referred to in private as strategic intimacy, and in public as nothing at all. Because the most powerful moves leave no visible trace. She heard about the leopard, and felt a cold thread of unease she quickly buried beneath calculated composure. She knew what the creature meant in the old traditions, knew what the texts said about the bond between a snow leopard and its chosen, a bond the old kings had called blood recognition. She also knew something very few people in the palace knew. Lena Ashvale's mother had not been the insignificant woman the official records claimed. Vivienne had found a single letter, misfiled in an administrative archive 3 months ago, that had kept her awake for 2 consecutive nights. She had not destroyed it, because she was too intelligent to destroy evidence without fully understanding its implications. Now, standing at her window watching the courtyard where a white leopard refused to leave the side of a woman who should not have mattered, Vivienne thought that perhaps she had waited a fraction too long. King Cassian Draveth learned of the leopard's arrival the way he preferred to learn of significant events, which was from multiple sources in rapid succession, each adding a layer of information that built toward a complete picture. His head advisor told him first, in the measured tone of a man delivering news he does not yet know how to categorize. His court historian told him second, in the trembling voice of someone who has spent 30 years studying ancient texts and is now confronting the moment when they stop being history and start being present tense. His head of security told him third, with the expression of a man who is professionally obligated to frame every situation as a threat, and is finding this particular situation resistant to that framing. Cassian listened to all 3 with the stillness that people in his court had learned to read carefully, because his stillness was not inertia, but focus. He was 31 years old, and had been king for 4 years, since his father's death had handed him a throne balanced on political pressures that would have crushed a less structurally sound person. He had not been crushed. He had become instead very precise. "Show me," he said, when all 3 had finished their reports, and they took him to the east courtyard, where the leopard was lying in a patch of thin winter sunlight, and Lena Ashvale was sitting cross-legged on the cold stones beside it, her papers abandoned, her hand resting on the great white head with an ease that suggested she had been doing this for years. Someone had apparently tried to move her inside, because Cassian could see the palace steward standing at a careful distance with the expression of a man who has made a request and been ignored so completely that he is still processing the experience. Lena was not looking at the steward. She was looking at the leopard, and her face in the winter light had an expression that Cassian had not seen on any face in this palace in 4 years of ruling it. She looked like a person who has put down a weight so heavy she had stopped noticing it was there, and the absence of it had made her, temporarily, very still. He stood and watched her for longer than he intended to. He told himself afterward that he was observing the leopard, assessing the situation, exercising appropriate caution. He told himself that the way his attention kept returning to the woman's face, rather than the creature beside her, was simply a function of the fact that human behavior was more politically relevant than animal behavior. He was a very precise person, and precise people are particularly good at lying to themselves in precise ways. "Who is she?" he asked, though he had already received a briefing. He wanted to hear how his advisors described her, because how people describe the unimportant things they consider unimportant tells you a great deal about what they actually value. "An archivist, Your Majesty," his head advisor said. "Lena Ashvale. Father was a minor noble. Died in some disgrace 6 years ago. She has been in the palace employ since. Works in the underground archives. Not a shifter, as far as anyone knows. No wolf, no rank, no family connections of note." He paused. "She should not be significant." "And yet," Cassian said. "And yet," his advisor agreed, with the tone of a man deeply unhappy about the "and yet." Cassian descended into the courtyard. He did this without announcement, which was not unusual for him, and the crowd parted with the Automatic deference of people who have been in the presence of significant power long enough that their bodies respond before their minds do. He approached the leopard and the woman carefully, not because he was afraid of the leopard, though a more ordinary man would have been, but because there was something in the scene that felt fragile, in the way that real things are fragile, not delicate but genuine. And he had learned that genuine things require a different kind of approach than the everything is performance quality that ruled most of his daily existence. He stopped a few feet away. The leopard opened one yellow eye, regarded him with calm assessment, and closed it again. This was not the response of a creature that feared kings. Lena looked up, and for a moment she did not seem to recognize what she was looking at. Or rather, she seemed to register his presence without immediately processing his rank, which was refreshing and slightly startling. Then something shifted in her expression, a tightening around the eyes, and she began to move as if to stand. "Stay as you are," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended, which was unusual for him. "I do not want to disturb it." Lena settled back slowly, watching him with eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, the color of the sea in winter. "I do not think you would disturb it," she said, and then seemed to catch herself, because her chin dropped slightly and she added more carefully, "Your Majesty." The title sounded neither sycophantic nor reluctant. It sounded like a word she was using correctly because it was the correct word, and nothing more. Cassian found this mildly extraordinary. "Has it spoken to you?" he asked, because the old traditions held that the snow leopard could communicate in ways that were not speech, but were not silent either. Impressions and emotions transferred through touch. Lena's hand was still resting on the creature's head. She considered the question, with a seriousness that suggested she was not going to answer it carelessly. "Not in words," she said at last. "But there is something. A feeling." She paused. "Recognition. Like it has been looking for me." She glanced up at him with an expression that mixed wonder with something more guarded. "I know that does not make sense. Very little about this morning makes sense," Cassian said, and heard something in his own voice that surprised him, a loosening of the habitual precision, the careful management of tone that he maintained the way other people maintain walls. "What is your name?" "Lena Ashvale, Your Majesty. I am in the archive service." "I know who you are," he said, and watched something flicker in her expression. Uncertainty first, and then a different kind of guardedness. The guardedness of someone who has learned that being known is not automatically a good thing. "I mean your given name. You said it already, but I wanted to hear it again in context." He was not sure why he said that. He noted, with the precision he applied to all things, that he was not sure why he said it, and filed that uncertainty for later examination. "Lena," she said, and the white head beneath her hand shifted slightly, a subtle pressure, as if the leopard approved. The day passed in a state of suspended normal, the palace continuing its routines around the disruption, the way water flows around a stone. The leopard did not leave Lena. When she was finally persuaded to come inside, because the cold was becoming genuinely problematic, and a junior archivist sitting on courtyard stones for 5 hours was creating a logistical difficulty, the leopard came with her. It walked through the palace corridors with the same ease it had moved across the courtyard, ignoring every attempt to redirect it, settling finally outside the door of Lena's small room in the east wing, with the finality of a decision that will not be revisited. Lena stood in the doorway looking at it. "You cannot sleep in the corridor," she told it. The leopard looked at her with yellow eyes that communicated, very clearly, that it could and would do exactly that. "All right," she said. "All right." She went inside, and the leopard lay down in front of her door, and the 2 guards assigned to observe spent the night drinking cold tea and trying to decide whether what they were witnessing was sacred or simply extremely strange. The answer, they agreed, was probably both. What Lena did not tell anyone, in those first hours, was the images. The leopard's touch communicated not in words, but in something older, rooted in something that felt like memory, but was not only her memory. When she had first touched the white fur through the gate bars, she had seen a woman with gray-green eyes and white hair standing at the edge of a glacier, a snow leopard beside her, something burning silver-white like cold fire in the woman's hands, the air around her thrumming with a frequency that Lena felt somewhere in. Her own blood. The vision lasted less than a second, and left behind a resonance like a bell still vibrating at the edge of hearing. Lena had spent 6 years reading texts that describe phenomena exactly like this. She knew what blood recognition meant. She knew what it meant when a sacred creature chose a host. She had simply never imagined it could have anything to do with her, because she had spent 6 years making herself as invisible as possible and had believed, with the conviction of long practice, that invisibility was the safest condition available to her. The leopard apparently disagreed. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her narrow bed listening to the leopard's breathing drifting under the door, slow and rhythmic, and thought about one manuscript in particular, a text so old that 3/4 of it had been illegible when she found it, which she had spent 4 months painstakingly recovering. She had set it aside when she reached a certain section, because the section spoke of a bloodline she had thought entirely mythological. A line of women descended from the first keeper, the legendary figure in the oldest Wolf Kingdom texts, who had been neither wolf nor human, but something that held both in balance, whose gifts ran through blood rather than bite. The text called them the Pale Daughters, which was a name Lena had always thought poetic rather than literal. She was beginning to reconsider that reading. She got up at 3 a.m, lit a lamp, and went back to the archive. The section she was looking for was where she had left it, sealed carefully in its preservation case, the partially recovered text spread across 2 large sheets of copying paper in her own precise handwriting. She had translated it from a dialect of Old Valdric that only 3 people in the palace could read, and she was the most fluent of the 3, which meant she was the only person who had seen these words in their full context. She read them again now, in the small hours of the morning with the lamp throwing orange shadows across the page, and this time the words arranged themselves differently in her understanding, the way words sometimes do when you approach them from a new angle, and suddenly the grammar resolves into meaning that was always there and was simply waiting for the right reader. The Pale Daughters carry the old fire. It cannot be trained or taught or given. It passes through blood and sleeps through generations, waking only when the need is great, and the Pale Hunter recognizes it before the daughter herself does. The Pale Hunter will find her. The Pale Hunter will always find her. And when she is found, the courts of men will shake, because what the old fire does in the presence of a true mate is not merely illuminate, it transforms. She read it 3 times. Then she sat back in her chair, pressed her cold hands against her face, and said very quietly to the empty archive, "Oh no." She did not mean it entirely. Negatively. But she was a practical person, and practical people, when confronted with evidence that their lives are about to become significantly more complicated, are allowed a moment of entirely honest dismay. She gave herself that moment. Then she folded it away, the way she had learned to fold away everything that could not be immediately useful, and began making notes. The political dimension of the leopard's arrival became apparent within 24 hours. The snow leopard was not a small disruption. By the second morning, 3 separate nobles had requested audiences with her, which was so far outside her ordinary experience that when the palace secretary delivered the first request, she read it twice, and then asked him to confirm that it was in fact addressed to her. He looked at her with an expression that contained, for the first time, a hint of genuine assessment. "It is addressed to you, Keeper Ashvale," he said. And then, very carefully, "Shall I tell them you are available? What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." She met with none of them. She spent the second day in the archive instead, retrieving every manuscript she could find that referenced the northern snow leopard, the first keeper, the pale daughters, the old fire, and the bloodlines of the pre-kingdom era. She found 9 relevant texts, and read them all with the focused attention she brought to everything she did, building something in her mind whose clarity frightened her in proportion to its precision. On the second afternoon, the archive door opened and she looked up expecting the secretary, and instead found King Cassian Dreveth standing at the top of the stairs, alone, without retinue or announcement, holding a lamp. He said, with the same directness she had noticed in him the previous morning, "I have been told you are refusing to see anyone." "I have been told that several people wish to see me," she said, which is a sentence I have never spoken before in my life and am still adjusting to. I thought it prudent to be better prepared before I spoke with anyone who has political motivations. He descended the stairs without being invited. She watched him do this with the slightly stunned feeling of someone observing an event that is technically possible, but that she had never placed in the category of likely. He stopped at the edge of her working space and looked at the manuscripts spread across the tables, and she watched him, take in the scope of what she was working on with an attention that was clearly genuine rather than courtly. "You read Old Valdric," he said. "I read 6 dialects of Old Valdric and 4 forms of pre-kingdom script," she said. "It is part of the reason I have this position." She paused. "The other part is that no one else wanted it." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but had the potential to become one. "What have you found? Why did you come down here?" "Yourself?" she asked, instead of answering, and then added belatedly, "Your Majesty." The almost smile resolved slightly. "Because the people around me are currently very interested in telling me what the leopard means, and what it means for the court, and what should be done about it. And I found myself wanting to ask the one person who has direct experience of the creature, and who does not, so far as I can tell, have a political agenda." He paused. "Am I wrong about that?" "I have no political agenda," she confirmed. "I have a great deal of anxiety, and about 9 manuscripts that are significantly disrupting my anxiety." He pulled a chair from the nearest table and sat down, which she had not expected, and looked at her across the spread of papers. "Show me," he said. The same words he had used the previous morning. And this time they landed differently, with a weight that had nothing to do with command, because he was not commanding. He was asking. She looked at him for a moment. This precise and careful king sitting in her archive in the lamplight, and made a decision that she recognized even as she made it as the kind of decision that does not unmake itself. She turned the nearest manuscript toward him and began to explain. They were there for 3 hours. She had expected him to be polite and superficially attentive in the way of busy people who have made time for something that is not their primary focus. He was not. He read the text she put before him with a concentration that matched hers, asked questions that demonstrated genuine comprehension, and twice corrected her translation of a word in a dialect she had thought he could not read. "You know pre-kingdom script," she said, with some accusation in her voice, because she had been simplifying her explanations, based on an assumption that had apparently been wrong. "My father believed that a king who could not read what his ancestors wrote was ruling blind," Cassian said. "He made me learn. I am slower than you, but I am not illiterate." He looked at the text before him. "This bloodline, the pale daughters. You believe this is real." "I believed it was a myth before yesterday morning," she said. "Now I think it is real, and I think I may be part of it. And I am telling you this because you are the king, and because the leopard is currently living outside my bedroom door, and because I think you should know before anyone else does." She met his eyes steadily. "Because someone will find out, and I would rather you know it from me." The silence that followed had a quality she was learning to recognize in him. The silence of rapid, thorough processing. "You have a theory about your mother," he said finally. She was briefly startled, then not. He was perceptive, and the logical structure of what she had laid out did lead inevitably to that conclusion. "My mother was not recorded in my father's documents," she said. "Her name does not appear anywhere in the official family papers. There is a single reference to a northern woman in a letter my father wrote to a cousin, and then nothing. I grew up being told she died when I was born." She paused. "The Pale Daughters appear most frequently in the historical record in connection with the Northern Territories, with the glacier lines, with the high peaks, with the exact territory," Cassian said carefully, "from which the northern snow leopard originates." "Yes," Lena said. Another silence. "This is significant," he said with an understatement that she thought was probably characteristic. "It is rather significantly significant, yes," she said, and heard her own voice come out with a dry precision that surprised her, because she did not usually speak this way to anyone, had not spoken this way in 6 years of careful invisibility. Something about this basement, this lamplight, this particular conversation, was loosening things she had kept carefully fastened. He almost smiled again, and then his expression shifted into something more complicated, and he said, "I need you to understand something. There are people in this court who will view what you represent, if this bloodline is genuine, as either an extraordinary asset or an existential threat, depending on their position. You are currently neither protected nor positioned to protect yourself. This concerns me." He said it the way he said everything, with precision. But there was something underneath the precision that she was beginning to recognize, a current of something warmer and less managed than the surface he showed the world. "I want you to be careful." "I am always careful," she said. "I have been careful for 6 years." "You have been invisible," he said, and the distinction was so precisely correct that she felt it like a physical sensation, a strike against something she had been treating as a wall, and discovering was actually a mirror. That is not the same thing. Invisible people become visible eventually. Careful people have plans for that moment. He looked at her steadily. "Do you have a plan?" She thought of the manuscripts spread across her working table. She thought of the leopard breathing outside her door. She thought of the vision she had not told him, the gray-eyed woman on the glacier edge with cold fire in her hands. She thought of 6 years of making herself small and quiet and unthreatening, and how well that had worked, and how completely it had just stopped working, all at once, in the space of a creature's yellow-eyed recognition. "I am working on one," she said. He nodded once, in a way that communicated more than the gesture itself should have been capable of communicating. Then he stood and looked at the manuscripts on the table and said, "I will come back tomorrow. There is a text in the Royal Archive that I think should be seen by someone who reads Old Valdric with your level of fluency. I will have it brought down." He paused at the foot of the stairs, and she was aware of him, as a physical presence in a way that felt different from her awareness of other people, more specific somehow, like a sound that is slightly different from background noise, and therefore reaches you even when you are not listening for it. "Lena," he said, and stopped, and seemed to decide against whatever he had been about to add. "Good night." "Good night," she said, and watched him go up the stairs, and sat for a long time afterward in the lamplight before she could make herself focus on anything else. 3 floors above, in her own suite of rooms with a fire burning and expensive wine breathing on the table, Vivian received her second visitor of the day with composed attention. The visitor was Lord Fenwick of the Northern Advisory, who reported that the king had spent 3 hours alone in the underground archives with the archivist, and that when he emerged, his senior advisors noted his expression was different in a way they could not precisely define, but found significant. Vivian listened with the surface of her mind while the underneath ran rapid calculations. She had known Cassian for 18 months, and had spent them proving herself competent and reliable in ways that would make her absence feel like a structural deficit. She believed she had made considerable progress. She had made him trust her, which she considered more valuable than love. And trust did not easily reverse itself. And now there was an archivist with a sacred creature at her feet, and a bloodline Vivian had been hoping to keep buried, and the expression Cassian came up with after 3 hours alone with her was different. She needed to deal with the letter before Lena Ashvale went looking for it, because people who spent years reading old documents developed an instinct for where missing pieces were hidden. She excused Lord Fenwick, waited until she was alone, and then sat for a long time with her wine, thinking. Vivian had not come this far by being reckless. She had also not come this far by being slow. The third day began with the Leopard doing something new. It had spent the night outside Lena's door, as far as the observers could tell. But when Lena came out of her room at dawn, the creature rose and preceded her down the corridor in a direction that was not toward the archive, and not toward any of the usual routes she took through the palace. It moved with purpose, pausing at each junction to look back at her. And Lena followed because the feeling she had come to associate with the creature's intentions, that resonant certainty, was telling her clearly that she should. It led her through the east wing, through a connecting passage she had used perhaps twice, through a gallery of old portraits whose subjects watched her progress with painted eyes, and stopped finally before a door in the north wall of the gallery that she had always assumed was a storage room. She had walked past this door hundreds of times. She had never tried the handle. The Leopard sat in front of it and looked at her with an expression of patient expectation, and Lena looked at the door and then reached out and tried the handle, and it opened. Beyond it was a small room, barely large enough for the 3 shelves that lined its walls, and on the shelves were documents in cases she recognized as the oldest preservation format used in the palace, the format reserved for materials so fragile they could not be handled without specific protocols. She stood in the doorway, and the feeling in her chest that she had been carrying since the first moment she touched the leopard's fur deepened into something that was almost sound, a resonance that told her, without words, that she had been meant to find this room. She looked at the leopard. "Did you know this was here?" she asked. The creature blinked slowly, which she was learning to interpret as a form of affirmative. She went inside and began, very carefully, to read. What she found took her until mid-morning to fully process. The documents were old, but not as old as the archive manuscripts. They were approximately 300 years old, which meant they dated from approximately the time of the snow leopard's last recorded appearance. They were letters, correspondence between 2 people whose full names were not given, but whose relationship was clear. A woman from the Northern Territories who was referred to throughout as M, and a palace official who signed each letter with a seal, rather than a name. A seal that Lena recognized from the royal administrative history as belonging to a particular family, a family that had died out 2 generations ago, and whose lands and titles had reverted to the crown. M wrote about a child, about a gift passed in blood, about a decision to hide the child in plain sight, to let the lineage sleep, to give the girl a name that was ordinary, and a life that was unnoticed, and a future that was safe in the way that invisible things are safe. The last letter was the shortest. It said only, "She does not need to know. Not yet. When the hunter comes back, she will know everything she needs to know. Until then, let her be ordinary. Let her be safe. The gift does not need a crown to be real," and signed, in the same seal, and then in handwriting underneath it, as if added later, a name, for Lena, when the time comes. She sat with the letter in her hands for a very long time. Her name was there. 300 years old, and her name was there. Written in a hand that had been dust for centuries. Written for her. Written with the assumption that she would one day come here and read it, and need to know that the choice to hide her, to protect her, had been made with love, and not with shame. She was crying, she realized, which surprised her, because she had not cried in a very long time. The leopard, who had followed her into the room, pressed its enormous head against her knee, and the warmth of it was specific and real and grounding in a way she needed. She pressed her face into the white fur and let herself be, briefly, entirely undone. Then she straightened, wiped her face, and thought about what she needed to do next. Practical. She had always been practical. Even undone, she was practical. The letter needed to go to the king, and it needed to go before anyone else found it. And she needed to think about what she was going to say when she gave it to him. What she did not know, sitting in that small room with the letter in her hands, was that she was being watched. Not directly, not physically, but through information. A servant who regularly reported to Vivian had seen the direction the Leopard took that morning, had noted the door in the north gallery, had sent word. By the time Lena was walking back through the gallery with the letter carefully secured, Vivian already knew the room existed. By the time Lena had reached the archive entrance, Vivian had already sent a message to a man she trusted to do things that should not leave evidence. By the time Lena was considering her next move, the calculation had already been made, and the counter-move was in motion. She did not go to the king immediately. She went to the archive first, because she needed to put the letter with her other materials, needed to think through the full implications before she acted. This was the mistake, though she did not know it was a mistake until later. She left the letter in the archive, sealed in a preservation case, and went to request an audience with the king. She was told he was in council and would be available that afternoon. She said she would return. She went back to the archive. The letter was still there. She spent 2 hours annotating her existing research with the new information, building the complete structure of what she now knew. And it was complete. It was coherent. It was irrefutable. And it meant that she was not who she had thought she was, had never been who she thought she was, had been hidden so thoroughly and so completely that even she had not known what she was hiding. She was the last of the Pale Daughters. She was the inheritor of the old fire. She was, according to 300 years of carefully preserved documentation, the legitimate blood descendant of a lineage that predated the current royal house. A lineage that did not threaten the crown, but that changed the political landscape in ways she was still working out. Ways that certain people would find very threatening indeed. She was also, she thought, sitting in her archive surrounded by everything she now knew, absolutely terrified and absolutely certain, which was a combination she had not experienced before and was not sure how to hold without dropping one of them. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The leopard growled. It was the first sound she had heard it make that was not the purring recognition that had characterized its communication until now. It was short, low, and unambiguous, and Lena was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand, the hairs on her arms risen, something in her responding to the creature's warning with a physical immediacy that bypassed thought entirely. The archive door at the top of the stairs was moving. She could see it in the lamplight, the handle turning, and there was something in the quality of that movement, the slowness of it, the deliberateness, that was different from the way people usually opened the archive door, which was with the slight impatience of people who are going somewhere and want to get there. The leopard was on its feet, and Lena realized that she had moved without noticing, had positioned herself behind the nearest shelf stack, which was ridiculous because there was nowhere to go in the archive except the door. But the instinct had happened, and she had followed it. The man who came through the door was not someone she recognized, which meant he was not regular palace staff, which meant he had been sent specifically, which meant someone knew she was here and knew what she had, and had decided that this was not a satisfactory situation. He was looking at the tables where her materials were spread, and he had not yet noticed her. The preservation case with the letter sat on the table where she had left it. He moved toward it with the directness of a person who knows what he is there to take. The leopard moved first. It covered the distance between them in a movement so fast it seemed less like motion and more like a relocation, one moment beside Lena, and the next between the man and the table, utterly silent. and the growl it produced now was not short, but sustained, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor and up through Lena's feet and into her chest, where it met something that she had not known was there, something that had been sleeping, something that the resonance of the leopard's voice seemed to be waking up. The man froze. He was probably trained for difficult situations, probably had experience with things that should have frightened him. The leopard in full threat posture, in the confined space of an underground archive, was apparently beyond the scope of his preparation, because he went very still, and his face went the color of old paper. "Call it off," he said, not looking away from the creature. His voice was controlled, but Lena could hear the control it required. "I am just here to retrieve some documents." "Those documents," Lena said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, "belong to the Royal Archive and are under my care." She stepped out from behind the shelf stack, because hiding was the old instinct, and she was finding in this moment that the old instinct was insufficient. She felt strange. She felt as if something in her was awake that had been asleep. The something the leopard had been waking since the first morning, and it was warm and electric, and she did not know what it was, but she knew it was hers. "I suggest you leave." The man looked at her, and then at the leopard, and then at the preservation case, making a calculation. The leopard made a sound that was not quite a growl, and not quite anything else, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees, and the man took a step back and then another, and then turned and went up the stairs at a speed that was not quite running but was close to it. The door closed. Lena stood in the archive with her heart hammering, and the warmth in her chest still present, still awake, and looked at the leopard, which had returned to her side with the easy completeness of a mission accomplished. "We need to go to the king," she said. "Right now." The leopard pressed its head against her hand in a way she had come to understand as agreement. She did not wait for a formal audience. She went to the council chamber directly, with the preservation case in her arms and the leopard at her side. And when the guards at the door tried to stop her, the leopard sat down and looked at them with yellow eyes until they stepped aside, which happened faster than she had expected, and with less resistance, and she knocked and did not wait to be invited, but opened the door and walked in. The council chamber held 7 people, all of them senior advisors, and Cassian at the head of the table, and everyone's expression changed in rapid succession, as they registered first the woman, then the leopard, then the combination of the two entering without announcement. Cassian rose, not with surprise, but with a focused attention, looking at her face, reading something in it that made him say, "To the room. Leave us." His advisors looked at each other and at the leopard and filed out, most of them with the expression of people who want to ask questions and have correctly calculated that now is not the time. The last one closed the door behind him, and Lena crossed the room to the table and set the preservation case down before the king. "Someone sent a person to my archive to retrieve this," she said. The leopard stopped him. "I do not know who sent him, but whoever it was knew exactly where to look, which means they already know what is in here." She met Cassian's eyes. "You need to read it." He opened the case and read the letter. She watched his face as he read. The controlled stillness that she had come to understand was not absence of feeling, but the management of it. And she watched. The management become, for a moment, insufficient. Watched something break through the surface that he did not try to hide. He set the letter down. He looked at her, and the way he looked at her was different from all the other ways he had looked at her since the first morning. Different in a way she felt rather than saw. And she had been trained by 6 years of solitude to distrust feelings, but the warmth in her chest that had been woken by the leopard's voice was responding to his gaze with something she could not dismiss as mere sensation. "This is from 300 years ago," he said. "Yes." "It has your name on it." "Yes." "That means," he said, very carefully, "that someone 3 centuries ago knew you would come here, knew there would be a Lena, and that she would need to find this." "The Pale Daughters," she said. "The bloodline passes through women, and it carries memory, or a form of it. The text suggests that the women who came before could, under certain circumstances, leave things behind for the ones who came after. Not messages, exactly. More like intention." She paused. "Someone loved me before I was born. Before my grandmother was born. Someone put this here for me to find." She heard her own voice become unsteady on the last sentence and felt, briefly, furious at herself for the unsteadiness. And then the furious feeling passed because it was not warranted, because it was all right to be moved by this particular thing. Cassian was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you 2 days ago." He sat back, and the precision he usually wore like a second garment was slightly loosened. She could see it, the edges of it shifting. "When I was told about the Leopard's arrival, I went to the historical archive before I went to the courtyard. There's a text there, a royal text, that is not kept in the general archive because it pertains specifically to the founding bloodlines of the kingdom." He paused. "It describes the mate bond between a pale daughter and a sitting king. It says the bond is recognized by the pale hunter, before either party recognizes it themselves." Another pause, and in it, the space between them felt like it had a quality, like air before rain. "I read it, and then I went to the courtyard to see you. And I told myself I went because of the Leopard." The silence that followed was not like the silences in the council chamber, the working silences of people managing information. It was the silence between two people who are standing at the edge of something that cannot be unapproached, looking at each other across the distance and understanding that the distance is smaller than it seemed. Lena felt the warmth in her chest, the waking thing, and it was not afraid. That surprised her. She had expected fear, given that she had been afraid of almost everything that mattered for 6 years, had been afraid, and had called it caution, and had been careful, and had called it safety. But the feeling that rose in her now, looking at him, was not afraid. It was the opposite of afraid. It was the feeling of someone who has been running for a long time, and has just realized that the thing she was running from was never chasing her, and that she can stop. She had not expected it to feel like relief. She had expected it to feel like more and harder things. Instead, it felt like setting down something very heavy and finding that her hands were free. "You came to see me," she said. Not the Leopard. She. "I came to see you," he confirmed, and his voice had the quality of a door opening. "I have been finding reasons to come back every day. I should have told you what I knew about the bloodline. I did not because I was not certain how to tell you, and I was not certain that you knowing it would be good for you, and I realize now that those are concerns that were not mine to manage." "No," she said, and there was no accusation in it, only clarity. They were not. And then, because the warmth in her chest had fully woken now, and it was not a metaphor, not a feeling she was projecting onto a physical sensation. It was genuinely something happening in her, light and heat, and a vibration like a chord struck in a very large room. "But you told me now." The Leopard, which had been lying by the door with the patience of a creature that understands that some things cannot be hurried, lifted its head and made the sound she had first heard at the gate. The recognition. Sound. The sound of something ancient completing a circuit it had been open for 300 years. Cassian looked at the creature, and then back at her. And what was in his face then was not the managed surface of a king, or even the focused warmth she had been catching glimpses of in the archive, but something more fundamental, something that she felt answer in herself, the way one tuning fork answers another, struck at the same frequency. He said her name the way he had said it the first. "Morning, Lena," and it sounded like a true thing, the way true things sound when they are spoken by someone who means them. She crossed the remaining distance between them, because she was done with the old instinct, done with invisible. done with the specific form of loneliness that dressed itself as safety. And she put her hand in his, and the warmth in her chest expanded into something that was most accurately described not as fire, but as light. The old fire the text spoke of, which was not destruction but recognition. The recognition of one fundamental thing by another. His hand closed around hers, and the leopard rose to its feet, and the winter light through the council chamber windows was, suddenly, very bright. The days that followed were not simple. Simple had never been the likely outcome, and Lena was too practical a person to have expected it. What followed was complicated and layered, and required everything she had. All the practical resilience she had built in 6 years. Of careful quiet. All the knowledge she had accumulated in her underground archive. And something new. The old fire that had woken in her, and was teaching her its vocabulary through the leopard's ongoing presence. She was still an archivist, still precise and careful and more comfortable with manuscripts than with court gatherings. But she was also something else. Something she was still learning to inhabit. Cassian helped. Not in the way of someone managing a situation, but in the way of someone who had decided to be present, and was present, consistently. He came to the archive. He listened to her reconstructions with genuine attention, made connections she had not seen, argued with her about interpretations in ways that improved her understanding, and was honest with her in the way that precise people are honest with each other, without ornament and without cruelty. Vivienne moved carefully. The man she had sent to the archive had not come back with the letter, and she adapted. Because adaptation was her primary skill. She appeared at the daily council proceedings with her usual composure, and watched the king and the archivist with the evaluation of someone building a new plan from the ruins of the previous one. She was also, in the still hours of the night, doing something she rarely permitted herself, which was examine the situation for what it actually was, rather than what it could be used for. She had spent 2 years building toward a future at Cassian's side, and she had believed in it, with the conviction of someone who cannot easily relinquish a goal. But perception was difficult to turn off, and what she perceived, watching Cassian in council, was a man more fully present than he had been before, as if a tension she had never identified as tension had released, and left him more completely himself. She had worked very hard to be important to him. She was understanding now, made him feel like that. The honest understanding assembled itself. Quietly, that what she wanted and what she had been pursuing were not the same thing, and possibly had not been for some time. The ceremony of the ice moon was in 3 weeks. Every person in the court knew this, and was calibrating accordingly, because it was the formal occasion on which Cassian was expected to announce his choice of queen. A choice delayed twice already, and pressed with increasing intensity by the advisory council. Lena had read every document in the archive that pertained to it. She had not discussed it directly with Cassian, because they were both aware of it, and the awareness sat in the space between them, with a weight she was not yet certain how to address. She was not going to ask him to choose her. What was between them was not a negotiation, but a recognition, and recognition did not require lobbying. But she was not going to pretend the ceremony had no bearing, because pretending things had no bearing when they did was the kind of thinking that led to avoidable disasters. "Tell me what you know about the ice moon binding," he said to her one evening in the archive, and she understood that he was not asking for a historical lecture, but for the specific information that was relevant to their specific situation. "The texts say," she said, choosing her words carefully, "that the ceremony has 2 forms. The formal court form, which is what everyone currently understands it to be. A public declaration of mate and queen, witnessed by the court, sealed by the pack bond. And the older form, which predates the court ceremony, which requires no witnesses and no formality, which is a private recognition between 2 people who have been bonded by something older than court tradition. The blood recognition." She paused. In the older texts, the formal ceremony is described as confirmation, not origin. The bond is not created at the ceremony. It is declared there. If it exists before the ceremony is simply making visible what is. Already true. She met his eyes. The leopard would not be here if the bond were not already real. He was quiet for a moment. You have been living with this knowledge for several days, he said, and his voice had that quality she had come to treasure, the precision that was also warmth. Without telling me. I was still learning how to hold it, she said. I am still learning. But I thought you should know, because the ceremony is coming and there are people who will try to use it against you. If they understand what it means, and you need to be prepared. She paused. I am not asking you for anything. I know, he said. That is one of the things about you that has made this very clear. He looked at her, and the managed precision was entirely absent now, had been absent with increasing frequency over the days since the council chamber, and what was in its place was simply him, the actual person beneath the king's composure, which was warmer and more certain and more present than she had initially understood. I do not need more time. I am not uncertain about this. The thing I am uncertain about is you, not in what I feel, but in what you want, and I will not assume. She thought of the letter in the preservation case. For Lena, when the time comes. She thought of 300 years of patience, of a bloodline that had waited and preserved and passed forward the possibility of this exact moment. And she thought of 6 years of her own invisibility, her own waiting, the specific quality of loneliness that comes from being in a place and not quite being in it. And she thought of the first morning, the yellow eyes through the iron bars, the feeling of being seen. I want this, she said. I want all of it. The complicated parts, and the frightening parts, and the parts I do not understand yet. I want it the way I have wanted things I believed I could not have for 6 years, which is very completely and with very little hope, except that now there is hope, and that, is disorienting, but it is also the best thing I have felt in longer than I can account for. She paused. I am not an orator. He moved toward her, and the lamplight was very warm, and the leopard in the corner made the sound she had first heard at the gate, the sound of completed recognition, and he put his hand along her jaw the way you touch something that is genuinely precious. And she understood, in the way she understood everything, which was from the inside out, that this was real, and she had not dreamed herself into it, and she did not need to hold it carefully, because it was not fragile in that way. It was strong in the way that true things are strong. And she turned her face into his hand and held on to that strength, because she had been waiting for something strong for a very long time. There is an old Valdric word that appears in several of the texts Lena had spent years translating. It has no direct equivalent in modern language. The closest rendering is the flowering of what was always present, and it refers to the moment when something that has been real for a long time becomes visible. The texts use it to describe the old fire, the moment when the blood wakes up, and what has been sleeping becomes awake. Lena had translated the word 12 times, and had thought she understood it as an abstraction. She was discovering that the distance between understanding a word as a concept and experiencing the thing it describes is approximately the distance between reading about the ocean and standing in it, and she was very completely in it now. The old fire warm and particular, and entirely hers, held on to the way she held on to the leopard's fur on the first morning, with the grip of someone who has found something real and knows it. The ice moon ceremony came on a clear night, cold and still. The moon so large it seemed to rest on the tops of the northern peaks, like a coin balanced on its edge. The great hall of Valdris Palace had been prepared with the formality appropriate to an event that the court had been anticipating for 2 years, candles and silver branches, and the specific arrangement of the pack seal that denoted a formal claiming ceremony. Every major noble family was present, every advisor. Every person of rank who had spent the past 3 weeks trying to determine what was going to happen, and had reached, variously, the correct conclusion, the incorrect conclusion, and several conclusions that were creative, but not accurate. Lady Vivian Ashford stood to the left of the main assembly, in a gown the color of deep water, her face composed with the precision of someone who has made a decision, and is carrying it with the uprightness it deserves. She had made her decision 2 days ago, in the still hours of the night, and it had not been simple, but it had been genuine, and Vivian found that genuine decisions, even painful ones, had a cleanliness to them that made the carrying easier. Lena stood at the edge of the hall, in a gown that the palace seamstress had produced in 48 hours, deep gray-green, the color of winter sea, which had been Cassian's suggestion, and which Lena had received with an expression that made the seamstress smile secretly to herself as she pinned the hem. The leopard stood beside her. No one had suggested leaving it outside, because the leopard was not a peripheral element of the situation, but a central one, and everyone in the hall understood this even if they understood nothing else. Lena looked at the assembled court with the calm attention she brought to everything, the calm that was not absence of feeling, but management of it, her own version of Cassian's precision, and she thought, I did not ask for any of this. I did not seek it, and I did not plan for it, and I would not, 6 weeks ago, have been able to imagine it. But I am here, and I am present, and this is mine, and I am going to stand in it the way I have been learning to stand in things, which is completely and without retreat. Cassian came into the hall last, which was the tradition, entering from the north door with his advisors behind him, and the hall quieted in the way that halls quiet in the presence of a king, not from obligation, but from the specific gravity of a person who takes up appropriate space. He was wearing the formal dark of the claiming ceremony, and he looked, Lena thought, like himself, and she was finding that this was the best thing she could say about anyone. He crossed the hall toward the center, where the pack seal was inlaid in the stone floor, and everyone moved to give him the space the tradition required, and then he stopped at the seal and looked not at the assembled court, but at her, and held out his hand. There was no speech, no formal announcement, no declaration directed at the advisors or the nobles or the political calculation that had been ongoing for 2 years. There was a king and a woman, and a 300-year-old bond, and a hand, held out with the simplicity of someone who knows what they want and is not afraid to show it. And Lena looked at the hand and thought of the first morning and the yellow eyes and the feeling of being seen. And she walked forward across the stone floor of the great hall of Valdris Palace with the leopard beside her, and she took his hand. What happened then was recorded in 3 separate accounts by people who were present, and all 3 accounts agree on the sequence of events, though they differ on the language used to describe it, because what happened was something that none of them had language for, and all of them were reaching for it with different vocabularies. The old fire woke completely. That is the plainest description. Whatever had been dormant in Lena's blood for 3 centuries, whatever the leopard had been waking since the first morning, whatever had been growing in the days since the council chamber and the archive and the lamplight and the warmth of one hand, closed around another, it woke fully and all at once in the moment of the formal recognition, and it did not destroy or terrify or overwhelm, because that was not its nature. It was not that kind of fire. It illuminated. The gray-green eyes that had always seemed an unusual color in the underground lamplight were extraordinary in the blaze of the great hall, extraordinary in the way that things are extraordinary when they are finally in the right light. The leopard raised its head and produced a sound that none of the 300 people in the hall had ever heard before, and none of them forgot afterward, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor and up through every pair of feet and into every chest, and stayed there. A resonance of recognition so deep it felt like memory, as if everyone present was remembering something they had never personally experienced, but that was nonetheless true. And Cassian looked at Lena with eyes that were not managing anything, were not precise about anything, were simply open. And she looked back at him the same way. And the bond that was 300 years old, and had been waiting with the patience of things that are certain, declared itself in the presence of every person who had ever doubted that it would. Vivian moved before anyone else, which was characteristic of her, and what she did surprised the people standing near her, because she did not protest or intervene or deploy any of the arsenal of political sophistication she had spent 2 years developing. She stepped forward into a space where she could be seen, and she inclined her head in a formal acknowledgement that was entirely genuine, one of the oldest gestures in the Valdric court tradition, the gesture that says, "I see this, I recognize it, I accept the truth of it." She did it cleanly, with the grace she actually possessed, and stepped back. People near her watched with expressions that ranged from surprise to respect, and she received both with the composure of someone who has made peace with a decision and is simply inhabiting it. She thought, briefly, that Lena Ashvale was going to be an extraordinarily interesting queen, and that she, Vivian, was going to need a new project, and found she was more invigorated by that prospect than frightened. The court took its cue from her, as it often had, because Vivian had been a weather vane for social momentum since her first month at Valdris, and what it saw was a woman of acknowledged sophistication, making a genuine gesture of recognition, and this made the gesture easier for others to make. And so they made it, one by one, and then in groups. The formal acknowledgement spreading through the hall, like the sound from the leopard's cry had spread through the stone floor, touching everyone, leaving behind it the changed thing, the thing that is different after it passes through. The oldest advisor, a man who had served 3 kings, and whose approval meant more than most people's active support, bowed his head last and longest, and when he raised it, his expression had the quality of someone who has witnessed something they had believed was only in the old texts, and is still absorbing the fact that it is real. He caught Lena's eye across the hall, and nodded to her with the respect of a man who has read the same text she has read and knows exactly what he is looking at. And she nodded back, because she did know what she was, finally, and it was extraordinary, and frightening, and real. And she was done with invisible. The formal declarations and political arrangements that followed the ceremony took weeks, and then months, and they were not uncomplicated, because nothing about the situation was uncomplicated. Lena navigated them the way she navigated everything, with practical attention and the patience of someone who knows the answer is in the text somewhere, and simply needs to read carefully enough to find it. Cassian navigated them beside her, which she found was the correct word, beside, not in front of and not behind, and the geometry of that was something she was still learning to be astonished by. The leopard was present for all of it, which proved clarifying, because the creature's presence had a quality that cut through performance, and left only what was genuine, which was sometimes uncomfortable, and was always useful. The archive remained Lena's. She made this clear early and without apology, and Cassian supported it with genuine enthusiasm. She continued her translations, found more texts in the months that followed, more letters in more small rooms that the leopard led her to with patient precision, and each one added to the structure she was building, the complete history of what she was and where she came from, and what the Pale Daughters had been and done and left behind for the ones who came after. She would write it all down eventually, in a text of her own, in clear modern language with honest assessment of what was known and what was inferred. She was beginning to understand that this, too, was the old fire, not just in the dramatic moments of recognition and declaration, but in the quiet, steady hours of translation and annotation, the daily work of making the past legible for the present. The last letter she found was at the very bottom of the last archive box, in the deepest room the leopard led her to, 6 months after the ceremony, in early spring, when the frost was finally releasing its grip on the palace. Grounds. It was addressed differently from the others. It was not addressed to Lena in the future, but to Lena in the present, as if whoever had written it had known not just that she would come, But when she would come, and what state she would be in when she arrived, it was very short. It said, "You thought being seen was the most frightening thing." But it was not. Being seen was the beginning. What comes after is not frightening at all. It is just life, your actual life, the one that was always waiting for you behind the one you thought was all there was. Take good care of it. It will take good care of you. Lena sat in the small room with the letter in her hands, and above her, in the rooms and corridors of the living palace, there was the sound of a life that was genuinely hers, the distant voices and the daily movement of a place where she was known and present and real. And through the ceiling she could feel the warmth of the morning sun working its slow way across the stone, and the leopard's head was warm beneath her hand, and she thought, "Yes, I will." She folded the letter carefully and held it to her chest for a moment. This last message from the women who had come before her and had loved her before she existed, and then she tucked it into the preservation case with the others, and she stood up, and she went upstairs into her actual life, and the leopard walked beside her, and the light that met her at the top of the stairs was very bright and entirely ordinary and the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?